Hi everybody! This video deals with theme, especially theme in short stories. As you probably know, theme is the central idea or meaning of a story. It's developed through characters, setting, the plot, symbols, and all the other literary elements of a story. When you're analyzing fiction for theme, however, it's important not to confuse the theme of a story with the different motifs in a story. A motif is a recurring image, a symbol or idea that often develops the theme. The theme, on the other hand, is the central idea or message of a literary work. So one way to sort of distinguish between these two things is to keep in mind that a motif can usually be summed up in like one or two words, but a theme can't. A theme usually needs to be summed up in one or two sentences. To give you a couple examples of this, some motifs, so different sort of ideas or symbols or ideas that are repeated in Sunny's Blues are the motifs of music, drugs, and darkness. That's a word that keeps popping up as well. So these are just examples of sort of different ideas or words or symbols that get repeated in the story. An example of a theme, on the other hand, would be the statement that music, particularly the blues, can allow people to cope with past traumas and find emotional freedom. So notice that this theme is a lot more complicated than a motif, and it's related to the motif. In fact, this theme is developed through motifs, and specifically it's developed through the motif of music. And if you go back to the story and look at it, you could also argue that it's also developed through this motif of darkness. However, it's much more complicated than just simply saying the theme of the story is music or the theme of the story is darkness. In fact, this theme is a claim about the significance of music. So it's a claim that needs to be usually explained within one or two sentences as opposed to a simple word or phrase. It's also important to keep in mind that most stories don't necessarily have simple morals or lessons. Sometimes when we read for a theme, we just sort of look for a sort of simple moral of the story. And some stories do have morals. However, you don't want to assume that a story has a moral, because most authors are, especially the authors that we're reading in this class, are more interested in representing the complexity of human experience than in distilling it to a simple life lesson. So most of the stories we're reading are interested in complexity as opposed to sort of black and white simplicity. To give you an example of this, sort of an oversimplified claim about the theme of Sunny's Blues might be the statement that Sunny's Blues shows that drugs are bad. That's a pretty simple black and white way of thinking about how drugs are treated within the story. And it also sort of overlooks the complexity of the character of Sunny, who has a pretty complicated relationship to drugs. And it also overlooks the complexity of the narrator's understanding of his brother, who begins the story with sort of one view of his brother and his brother's relationship to drugs. And over the course of the story, sort of modifies that view of his brother. His understanding of his brother becomes a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced. So a better claim about the theme of Sunny's Blues, at least when we're talking about drugs, would be that Sunny's Blues shows that some people turn to addictive drugs in order to cope with suffering. So the second statement is less simplified, and it does a better job of accounting for the complexity of Sunny's character and also recognizing the narrator's sort of gradual changing of his view of Sunny. So the narrator initially sort of just sees Sunny as making this really bad choice and is really frustrated. And as the story goes on, he comes to understand why his brother made this choice and what drove his brother to make this choice and the ways in which his brother is still struggling with his choice. So the second statement is more complex and recognizes the complexity of the story. So these are things to think about when you are reading the stories for this week. So be keeping in mind how all these different elements like plot and characterization and symbolism and these repeated ideas, these repeated motifs, all develop ideas within the story. So I look forward to seeing what you have to say about theme in the stories this week.